Welcome everyone. Shannan here, co-founder at Rosterfy, and joined by Tim. Tim and I have met early days, I suppose, of AMSI, mate, wasn't it? Through COVID, trying to just see how we can help with the mass participation space in Australia. And I guess at the time, and what your experience is obviously listed there, but you were the founder of Parkrun here in Australia. And then since then have gone on to some really awesome work. I look at the work you're doing, and I have for a long time, mate. And it's and with young kids myself, I just find it's really important, the stuff you're doing with Healthy Kids Project and the Rad Run Club. You're trying your hardest to get into schools around Australia. So, mate, it's a real pleasure to have you on here today and have a chat about all things volunteering. So, mate, thanks for joining us, Tim.
Great. I'm really looking forward to the chat, and I know that 30 minutes is going to be like, we're not even going to get started. So let's crack on.
Yeah, beautiful, mate. Lovely. Well, I guess for a very quick one, for those that don't know about Rosterfy, here's some of the customers that we work with around the world. So hopefully there's some experience there gained from, I guess, probably the larger end of major events and sports, but now also working with a lot of national sporting and state supporting bodies to better manage their volunteers. And in terms of the impact we're having around the world, now delivering over 160 million volunteer hours through the platform. And just for perspective, the last FIFA World Cup in North America, I think we did 1.6 million volunteer applications, 15,000 shifts a day. So just ginormous when you think about volunteering. So hopefully some good learnings from both ends of the spectrum here as well today. So Tim, let's just crack it off. When we talk about Parkrun, talk to us about how it's created such a great culture in volunteering. Like, I think everybody looks at Parkrun saying, wouldn't it be great if we had a volunteering culture like Parkrun? You want to talk to us about the early days there and how you built that?
Yeah, and I guess, I was volunteer number one, if you think of it from that regard here in Australia. It wasn't certainly a job when we started it or anything like that. But look, I was really lucky. It was when I started Parkrun in 2011. It was the early days of social media. Definitely not like your sort of social media experience these days. And we started the first event on the Gold Coast in April 2011, and that was just through networking, with the local community, guys from run clubs and so on, because we all thought what we were doing really was starting some sort of run club. I think that's what the gist was. Yep. Anyone who knows anything about Parkrun knows that the running is almost secondary to the community connection. Then that's what Parkrun is now. It's an incredible community of like-minded people. Yes, we come together and run or walk or jog or walk the dog and push the pram, whatever it might be. But the key thing there is about coming together. But back in 2011, it was like, okay, it was and so got the first one up and running on the Gold Coast. A few months later, another one in Brisbane, and so on. And it grew to a point of being about probably 25 events around Australia. That was all just growing through Facebook, through me just putting some posts on Facebook and sort of spreading the word that way. And it got to a point where I had 25 different event managers or event directors calling me on a Saturday morning, and I was like, all right, if this is work moving forward, we need to put some structure. Book not long before that, how Flight Centre grew its footprint around Australia, with the family concept being the store, the village being a number of stores, and then the tribe being a wider territory. And the magical number there was 7. So it was sort of 7 employees in a store, 7 stores makes a village, etc. And so I sort of tapped on the shoulder of some of our early event directors in those days, the ones who I built strong relationships with, and I said, guys, we need to create a new layer of volunteer management, and we called them the territory directors, or the TDs was the nickname. And the TDs was all about 7 events. So you would have one TD responsible for roughly 7 events, and that could be 7 existing events, or it might be 3 existing events and then mentoring some new events coming on. But it was just about basically creating this organizational structure. And that is what enabled Parkrun to grow in the way that it did, with me being able to sustain that. I was the only employee of Parkrun for probably the first 3 or 4 years. And so if it had been all those events reporting into me, there's no way I could have done that. So we created this structure, and that just scaled as Parkrun grew. In time, it's changed names. The territory directors are now called ambassadors, which was just a globalization of that role. But yeah, I look back on it really fondly, and I know there's people on this call today who were involved in those conversations right back in those days who are probably nodding their head right now. So, and I guess so the learning there in terms of anyone who's on this call, whether you're coming from a sport background or it's a, any other type of community event, and even, my mum, who's very church going, talks to me about how they grow their volunteers at their church. It's the same concept, which is, you have to create some structure around it if you're trying to scale. It doesn't have to look exactly like what I just described, but if you don't have any structure, you're setting yourself up to fail.
Yep. And it just cut out for a second when you're talking about the flight center. It sort of joined back in when you mentioned flight center. You and I spoke at length about this in advance. That was the sort of model that you looked at because it was getting a bit overwhelming with all the phone calls on a Friday night, Saturday morning saying, Tim, we're short on volunteers here, we're here. And that would be very familiar, I would imagine, for a lot of the people on this webinar going, it's all on me, I'm the top of the pyramid. And so the flight center scenario you gave the example of was around building the structure to handle that response and management. Tim, a question though. It's all well and good if you can pay those people, right, to manage those volunteers and the state leaders, etc. You weren't able to pay them, or at least at the start. How did you manage to recruit someone to take on more load as a volunteer, Tim?
And also, just Shannan, when I'm talking, if it does cut out, tell me, and I'll move because I can sort of move around. So just let me know.
You're fine, mate. It was only that small bit. You're fine.
Okay, great. I can move on the fly if we need to. Yeah. So look, I think the key element there was that the people that I was asking to step up into this new role were people who I knew were already really invested in wanting to make a difference in their community. And this was really just an extension of that, so it was like, okay, well, at the moment, what you're doing is you're making a big difference in your local community. But if you step up into this next role, wrap it up, but you can now have that impact across a broader community. And so I guess it's tapping into the people who had that mindset and that motivation. Not everyone wanted to do it. I remember we had one territory director who, they were an event director, they became a territory director, and after a few months they said, you know what, we prefer just being an event director because we actually really only want to focus on our local community. And of course that was fine. I said, yeah, completely understand. So yeah, that was what it was about. Are we having trouble with the connection again?
No, mate, you're fine. You're fine. I'm not sure what that was. It's all good. That's good. So I guess that's where a lot of the national sporting bodies that are here and state sporting bodies, they rely on those sort of club leaders, club presidents, whoever it might be, to take on a lot of that load. What are some learnings you had about that through that experience, Tim, of like, because everyone talks about burnout for those people that take on that load that is more than just the volunteering at a park run on a Saturday morning. What are some learnings you reflect on with that management level of volunteers who are volunteers, Tim?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm president of my local junior rugby union club, and I'm also president of the wider district here up in North Queensland. And what you typically see, and everyone will say this, it's the same people that put their hands up for these different roles year on year. And like, that's great. It's great that people have the passion to do that, but that's also a problem because you're not capacity building for future for when people do step away. I have a personal belief that the model of clubs, the structure where each club has to be its own legal entity with its own president, secretary, and treasurer, etc. I don't think that works anymore. So I'm a big advocate for what we call shared services model. So what that could mean, for example, is if you've got an association of, let's say, netball clubs, there might be 8 clubs in an association, rather than having 8 treasurers, some who may have a finance background, some who may not, those clubs could all chuck in a few dollars and pay a bookkeeper or a CFO to run their books for the whole association. The people on the committee, who probably are just passionate netballers, can focus on what they love, which is netball coaching, encouraging their kids, and they're not having to focus on running the books of a netball club, which junior sports clubs or sports clubs in general are small businesses. That's what they are, and sometimes quite complicated. And so I think, yeah, there's a shift now away from, or there should be a shift away from having all these different volunteers burning out, filling roles that they're not necessarily qualified for and probably don't really want to do. They're just doing it because it's their child's club or it's their club, and bringing in shared services and creating a revenue model to pay for that.
Yeah, okay. So I think we spoke yesterday around sort of two ideas there. One is around saying, what are the roles that you currently have volunteers filling, but perhaps with people that are just doing it to get by and to lean in and do more, right? And that might be the bookkeeping and some sort of more senior level, really critical roles. And the challenge to perhaps some clubs and sports might be, well, maybe they could be shared service as a paid resource then, that it doesn't hurt so much when that volunteer inevitably might leave the club because their daughter's no longer playing netball. So that's one sort of suggestion there. The other suggestion, Tim, we spoke about was around framing your roles more for volunteers to link with what they want from it as well. And so instead of perhaps saying, here's the help we need, you just need to come and fill the roles that we need. How do we frame for our community and what they want to get out of it in return? Tim, how did you do that at Parkrun? What was your learning from that experience?
Yeah, so we're talking about engineering a volunteer role to match the individual. And I think, you know, one of the things about volunteering at Parkrun, and I think more broadly volunteering in certainly sport, the Play Well strategy, which is the Australian Sports Commission's strategy for sport participation, which has been co-designed by the entire sporting sector, is it should be safe, inclusive, welcoming, and fun. And when I think about volunteering at Parkrun specifically, tick, 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 right? So, you know, the roles are safe. We're not asking people to do anything that's wild and crazy. It's inclusive in that you can be shown how to do that role in about 2 minutes. It's welcoming. You know, you go to any park run, all the volunteers get a big clap at the start, everyone gets high-fived, you know, you feel like you're part of something. And, you know, it's fun. Like, you're fun because you're with cool people, you're out on a Saturday morning. And so when I talk to people from other sports and I say, well, is what you're offering, if you're going to get volunteers, is your offering safe, inclusive, welcoming, and fun? Quite often they think about, well, you know, we need someone to do this job. That job, I won't come up with an example, but like, never be. And I said, well, who does that job? Well, we just get one person to do that job. I said, okay, well, if you had 2 people doing that job together, you've just made it fun because you've made it social. So those 2 people will be able to talk, and possibly at the end of the day, you go home from your roster shift and you've made a friend. And then that's a huge benefit. So yeah, maybe the actual job itself was not fun, but the experience of doing that job with a person was fun. So you can engineer the role to make it more appealing and make it more rewarding.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. And with that, though, I guess a challenge to that, Tim, would be if you're doing that, you're then kind of doubling the amount of volunteers you might need on a Saturday morning. So perhaps a question for you, how did Parkrun go about finding new volunteers? I know they do a lot in the running space and groups and engaging them. Like, what are some ideas of volunteer recruitment perhaps that Parkrun did really well?
Well, I think one of the key elements to that is that at Parkrun, participation is considered everybody that's involved. And so that's whether you're running, walking, or volunteering. So the volunteers are held in the same regard or the same stead as people who are actually getting out and doing the 5K. Now, you go to a lot of sports and they'll talk about, we had 25 participants and 15 volunteers. All right, so straight away, you're creating a segregation between the 2. So, you know, at Parkrun, everyone feels like they're part of it on an equal footing. Not one is regarded as more important than the other. So I think that's a learning straight away. And that's just language. You know, that's just language and culture. You know, how do we value these volunteers? Are we valuing them the same as the participants, or are we considering them a participant in their own right? So I think that's a really important thing in terms of the framing of the language. And then there's lots of other rituals that go on at Parkrun. Like I said, you know, there'll be a volunteer briefing at the start where everyone's introduced to each other. And then, before the event starts, it's a round of applause for all of the volunteers. So there's a lot of things done to make you feel really good about the fact that you have volunteered. And then you get an email at the end, thank you for volunteering. Obviously automated, but people still appreciate it. That's not to say that they necessarily read it every week, but when you see an email come into your inbox that says thank you for volunteering, it's like, yeah, that's good. I'm appreciated here. So I think there's so much you can do. But like what we did talk about, Shannan, yesterday when we were preparing is, and what I've found is the most powerful thing anyone can do is just walk up to someone, put your hand on, give them a high five or give them a pat on the back and just go, hey, you know what? I really appreciate you. Like, I really appreciate what you did today. What that job.
Yep, perfect, mate. Hey, just cutting out slightly there, just so you know. Sorry. So if we move on a touch, so I've just this week talked to 2 different state sporting bodies who have a real challenge with retention of volunteers, Tim. And so I guess in sporting and especially in youth sport land, the retention of volunteers is challenging when your daughter or son finishes the sport. Naturally, what's the reason why you're going to keep coming back? You know what I mean? Which might be a little different to Parkrun. So perhaps do you want to just talk about what were some things you did really well in retention, perhaps more than just the pat on the back and the automated emails and things? Like, how did you think about retention of volunteers? Or perhaps you didn't think about retention of volunteers. You were just happy to get anyone to turn up, even if they were new people each time. Like, what's your thoughts on retention there, Tim?
Yeah, well, I think, and I've moved now, so hopefully we've got a better connection.
Yeah.
But so I think with retention, ultimately with Parkrun, right, it's on every Saturday and it's always going to be free. And so I think people who want to regularly participate as a runner or a walker, they understand that if they want to do that over a long period of time, that they're probably going to volunteer as well over a long period of time. And that might be once a month or once every 6 months or whatever that looks like. But I think the retention is kind of engineered into the fact that people want to keep coming back to Parkrun and keep it alive, keep their local Parkrun event alive. There's also the milestone program within Parkrun where once you've volunteered for a certain number of times, you get a t-shirt, and a lot of people aspire to get those shirts. And that's obviously, you get those for whether you run or you walk or you volunteer, but people aspire to get that. So again, from a retention piece, whether Parkrun's trying to retain people to run and walk or retain people to volunteer, it's all part of that same motivation.
Yeah, understood. Okay. And I think that your point there around that volunteer recognizing the importance of their work to sustain what the sport is delivering in sports world, that's often for their child, basically. So, and that's typically how and why a lot of volunteers stick around, is knowing without them that it's going to be really hard to deliver that same experience for their kids. And I guess the challenge then is around retaining them, that they want to help that next generation of kids once their kids have finished up. I find that's a real challenge. And I guess the chat's open, team, for anyone that wants to put in any questions or comments in there around that specific scenario, because I find that's a challenge of enticing those volunteers to say, even though your kid's finished up, we'd love you to stick around. But perhaps, Tim, that's where your suggestion of the milestones and the recognizing those volunteers for the amount of work they're putting in is something that sports could take away from this. Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, I think 100%. And, obviously there's a sport volunteer passport that, intimately well that the Sports Commission and yourselves are working on at the moment. And I think, having a piece like that cuts across sports as well. So we're talking about retaining people, not just in a single sport, but in the notion of wanting to volunteer at things, in the volunteering ecosystem. So I think, that's going to, be helpful as well. So I think the other thing as well is succession planning, and so you're not always going to be able to keep people, but if succession planning has been done on the committee, then that should be, those transitions should be smoother. And often you see it in junior sport, that succession planning just doesn't happen.
Yep. Tim, just a reflection on like a local, I'm in Geelong, right? I know there's a couple in Geelong, but like at a local on the Barwon River, do you find from memory that one Parkrun at Balyang River would have the same volunteers each week infinitely, Tim? Or is each week it's kind of loosely a different bunch of volunteers because they're all just rolling through? They'll participate one week, then they'll volunteer the next. So my question is more around how stuck in the way of saying we're relying on these 6 people or otherwise Geelong falls apart versus, you know what, we're happy for anyone to roll through because we've made our program so accessible, Tim. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. And look, I think you'll have some parkrun events who will tell you, yeah, it's the same people every week. There will be some who say that. That might be that they're small regional events or whatever might be the case. That's obviously not ideal. You'll have others where there's lots and lots of volunteers. So it really depends on the actual event. But I think the key in terms of answering your question is around making sure that volunteer roles are simple. So Parkrun can train, you can turn up at Parkrun having never volunteered there before and be shown how to do pretty much every role in about 30 seconds. Other than probably the run director, who's the person who's overseeing the entire thing on the day. You can't show them how to do that in 30 seconds, but all the general roles. So I think, again, lessons for people on this call is it's like simplifying what the roles may be so that people can just turn up and do it. Even if, they're not always going to just turn up and do it, because you might have scenarios where it's the same people time and time again. But if the roles are simple, then you're going to be able to explain them and you've got a high chance of being able to, get more people involved.
For sure. And so you spoke about it before, how the progression of volunteers from perhaps that person rocks up on a Saturday, has a great time and says, what an awesome community. And then, Tim, it'd be right for you guys to look at that and say, wouldn't that be a great next race director sort of volunteer level, or, the next state leader? How did you go about progression with those people, finding them and then potentially training them too, Tim, so that they could take on more? Like, what did that process look like, identifying and then upskilling, I suppose, Tim?
I mean, to a certain extent, it was organic in that the people who had the enthusiasm and the drive and I guess the skill set, and a lot of that skill set, we're really talking about communication, being able to talk like we are right now. Those people sort of organically appeared. You sort of knew who the ones were who would have that potential to step up into a different role. And also not just, volunteer roles, the majority, particularly in the early days of Parkrun, the majority of staff came from the volunteering ranks, because they were people who were, if you think about volunteering as one long job interview, right? So anyway, the people that were, who did become employed by Parkrun, I'd known them for years, and I'd worked with them for years, and so it was just a case of working with them now in a different capacity. So there was an organic process to it, and obviously Parkrun being part of a global organisation. There are processes as part of that as well, particularly now, probably less so when I was involved, but I've been out for 4 years now. But, I'm sure that the sort of globalization of Parkrun and the processes involved with that now would be, pretty well developed. And so that notion of being able to move from being a volunteer to a run director to an event director to an ambassador, and there's a whole range of different types of ambassadorial roles, that would be pretty well documented. And Parkrun has its own ambassadors hub, which is like a digital platform for all people to get in and have a look at. So I think there's lots of layers to it, but those people typically organically, you know who they are.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. No, it sounds good. Thank you. All right. So look, we've got 5 minutes or so left. Please, guys, if there's some questions you had for Tim or, about the program, please do put them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll just keep yappering on, Tim, about these things. I'm also keen, just while we have the audience, to talk about Rad Run Club and what you're doing around the country too. Do you want to just give us a quick summary there, mate, and how people can get involved, Tim?
Yeah, 100%. So I left Parkrun in 2022. And I sat there with a piece of paper and I said, what is my passion? What do I want to do moving forward? And it was all about trying to create programs to make kids healthier, children healthier. So I now run a charity called the Healthy Kids Project. And our sort of flagship program is called the Rad Run Club, RAD standing for resilience, attitude, and determination. So it's all about taking all the lessons that I learned from Parkrun, all the things that made Parkrun successful, and then applying that in a different setting. So applying that in a primary school setting so that kids can get active before school. It's got all the digital side of it. It's gamified. So there's the milestones and everything like that that you have at Parkrun. And the ultimate goal is I want kids to be able to go to school and turn up in their classroom and be ready to learn. And at the moment, a lot of kids are arriving after coming from, might be junk food for breakfast, or it might be screens in the car on the way to school, whatever that might be. Get on the oval, run around for 10, 15 minutes with your mates, walk around, do cartwheels, whatever it might be, move your body for 10 to 15 minutes. And then when you get to that classroom, they're so much better at being ready to learn, being ready to concentrate. They've run off the crazy energy and they're ready to go. So that's the goal. So we're in over 100 schools now around the country. It's growing really well. I feel like I did in the very early days of Parkrun when that was growing, and the sort of excitement that I felt for that, and I feel like that again. So certainly, if anyone on the calls, has kids in a primary school or is from an education background, I'd love to I'd love them to reach out and see how we can get Rad Run Club in the local primary schools.
Yeah, love it, mate. It was certainly trying to get it in down Geelong way. So that's I think it's such an awesome thing you're doing, and it's great that it's come from such an epic background of Parkrun too, with that experience. So if we can get our kids active and having fun, like that's the goal, mate. So well done on that. It's an exciting journey. I've been tracking closely. So good stuff, mate.
And I think with the Olympics on the horizon, and the buzzword around any Olympics is legacy, right? And stadiums and gold medals and all that. That's all great, and I'm as big an advocate for all of that as anyone else. But the number one legacy for me is we want kids to be inspired to move. And I'm not talking about do cross country. Like, they can do that if they want, but you just got to get them moving and just moving their bodies, get off the couch, move your body, improve your health, improve your mental health. And like I said, be ready to learn when you get to school. And if that was a legacy of Brisbane 2032 and, any other mass participation event that's around, then to me, that's a win.
Yeah, love it, mate. I couldn't agree more. We probably look at the legacy from volunteering for Brisbane around that volunteer legacy, and what we're talking about is green and gold runway of volunteering. How do you start and build this culture of volunteering across Queensland is so exciting. The opportunity ahead, but always challenging, isn't it, with government and process and just time, isn't it? It's so early to start thinking about these things, but I think we're moving in the right direction. So, mate, we might wrap it a minute early. It's been really great hearing from you around your experience with volunteering in Parkrun. If I can try and summarize it as best I can, I think number one, like it's hard to build a great volunteer program if everything is coming back up to you at the top. So how do you build in a sustainable, structured, scaled approach with leaders that don't have to be paid, that can be volunteers, but you got to entice them with roles that are attractive to them and respect them in a fun, friendly environment, just like the volunteers. Around making roles accessible to volunteers, you'll always be caught with the same volunteers forever if the roles aren't accessible for anyone to roll in and be able to do. Another thing you mentioned there was around how do we get people volunteering together where potentially the job itself might not be that fun, but by having an interaction with Tim and Shannan, we're hanging out, meeting another dad, we can chat and walk away from that being a fun experience. So, mate, they were the main ones for me. It's been really great having you. So, Tim, good on you, mate, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, mate.
Good on you. All right, thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.